My name is Chloe, and today we will be studying the story of Yuan and the orchids of Jiuwan stream. As before, we will consider exactly why it's useful to be able to talk about this story in English. We will also focus on how to condense this story so we may be able to retell it during a regular conversation. However, today, we'll also learn ways in which you can make a conversation more colloquial or informal. Let's begin, shall we? This story focuses on a man called Yuan. Can you remember where we've heard this name before? Yes, you're right. It's from the origin of the Dragon Boat Festival. But today, we won't be explaining the festival. Instead, we will be explaining exactly why Chinese people attach so much meaning towards a particular flower, the orchid. To be able to reuse information and anecdotes for different purposes is a particularly useful skill to have. So where do we go from here? Firstly, we should consider why it's beneficial to be able to retell this story in English. That's your first task of the lesson. I'd like you to take some time to answer the following question. For what reasons would it be useful to be able to retell the story of Yuan and the orchids of Jiuwan stream in English? Try to think of at least 3 reasons, and when you are ready, you can play the video. Hello, thanks for that. So let's see what you have. Are your answers similar to mine? This is what I wrote down. Number 1, it would be useful to bring this story into a conversation when talking about Chinese cultural icons. It seems that Yuan has a place in a variety of Chinese stories. Number 2, if a friend is interested in nature, you can perhaps talk about how China places specific importance on certain flowers. And this story explains the reasons behind the importance of the orchid. Number 3, Yuan wrote many poems in his life, many of which are still recited in China today. One of his most well-known poems is that which talks about the fragrant plant beauty which refers to the orchid. Anyone who enjoys literature might like to know the inspiration behind such poetry. There are just a few reasons why it's beneficial to be able to speak about this story in English. However, I'm sure you have different ideas of your own, right? So in the first lesson with David, you learned all about the story of Yuan, the orchid goddess of Fairy Mountain and the beautiful orchid flowers. After reading the story, I certainly felt more appreciation towards the orchids. However, the story was incredibly long. Do you think that you could recite the whole story, detail by detail, whilst having an informal conversation with a friend? No? Why not? Exactly, it's way too long. So now we need to condense it, in the hope that we can eventually retell it without reading it or using notes. I'll help you by showing you some questions on the screen. These are just a guide. If you feel the need, you can add extra information where you think it is necessary. Your task is to condense this story to around 350 words. Ready? Go. Hi, right, okay, let's compare our summaries. Mine goes a little something like this. Long ago, in the kingdom of Chu, a poet called Yuan was unfairly banished by King Huai due to the king's evil ministers spreading rumors that Chu was conspiring against him. Saddened, Chu took his books and orchids to remind him of his beloved homeland and set up school on Fairy Mountain. There he promoted righteous conduct for the kingdom of Chu. This impressed the orchid goddess, who overheard his inspirational and patriotic words. Knowing that Chu loved his orchids, she gave them magical powers. Sadly, Chu became sick, and as he was teaching, he coughed up blood onto the orchids. This shocked and upset his students. Astonishingly, the next day, the 3 orchids had turned into a huge cluster. When Yuan breathed in the fine flower fragrance, he instantly became healthier. The students saw that the orchids were enchanted and so planted more around the school. Every day the flowers doubled, tripled and quadrupled in number. Before long, the whole of Western Lin Gorge was filled with orchids and their beautiful scent wafted all around. Years later, Yuan left teaching to serve his country, and Chu had been ransacked by rival kingdoms. Unfortunately, not long afterwards, on the 5th day of the 5th month, all the orchids in the mountain withered and died. The villagers hoped their fears weren't true, but 2 days later, they heard that Yuan, overwhelmed with grief, had thrown himself into the Miluwa River. The people of Chu wept with sorrow, but were comforted by the faint smell of orchids that still lingered on, a continuous memory of the selfless Yuan. In China today, the orchid is significant and symbolic. It is known as the gentleman of flowers, and Yuan is known as the orchid god. Yuan continuously gave his service like the orchid gives his scent. He did not mix with sinful men like the orchid does not often grow amongst weeds. Chu withstood the harshest of circumstances as the orchid withstands the winter's frost. He believed himself to be pure and virtuous, just like the nature of the orchid. Okay, what do you think? It certainly includes all of the information we need to explain this story to our foreign friends. But unfortunately, there's a big problem. Well, actually, a long problem. Correct. It isn't short enough, right? We have to try and get this story down to around 6 to 7 sentences so we can memorize it. That's your challenge. I'll put my summary on the screen, but you can use your first draft to help if you need it. You have around 10 minutes to write a shorter version. Go! Okay, let's see if your shorter version is similar to mine. Up in the fairy mountains lived a selfless man called Yuan, who had been unfairly banished from his beloved kingdom of Chu. There, he promoted righteous conduct for the kingdom of Chu, which impressed the orchid goddess, who had overheard his inspirational, patriotic teachings. As a reward, she enchanted Chu's orchids, which he loved as they reminded him of his homeland. Weeks later, Chu became sick and coughed blood upon the orchids, but this encouraged the flowers to grow, and a day later 3 flowers became a bunch. Chu breathed in the orchid scent and was instantly healthier. The flowers continued to double and triple in number, and soon the whole gorge was filled with orchids. Later, Chu heard that his cherished homeland had been overthrown. On the 5th of May, overwhelmed with grief, Chu threw himself into a river. Sadly, on his death, the orchids of the mountain dried and died with him. In China today, the orchid is significant and symbolic. Yuan continuously gave his service and did not mix with sinful men. Withstood the harshest of circumstances and believed himself to be pure and virtuous. Likewise is the nature of the orchid, the gentleman of flowers. Okay, so there is my summary. It's just under 200 words, so it could be shorter, but we're not done yet. Why, I hear you ask? Well, we are going to do something a little differently this season, and we are going to consider our audience a little more. The last summary you wrote would be ideal for an examination. It's formal in its manner, and the vocabulary that you use is varied and complex. But would this be suitable or relevant for a conversation between two teenage friends? Can you imagine saying to a friend, Chu withstood the harshest of circumstances and believed himself to be pure and virtuous. Likewise is the nature of the orchid. No. In fact, I think I would laugh if you approached me speaking sentences like that. So now, what I would like you to do is the following. Pause the video. I want you to read over your final summary or mine a few times. Then I want you to put your paper down and get your phone out. Next, video yourself retelling this story as best you can in just 1 to 1.5 minutes. Don't worry about the vocabulary you use. Don't worry about the mistakes. Just go for it. It's meant to be a realistic talk, so you will naturally have pauses and a few errors here and there. Save your video. If you feel comfortable, you can send it to me to watch. I will give you the details at the end. When you are ready to continue the lesson, you can see my funny attempt. Okay, off you go. Okay, so this was my attempt at retelling. Right, there was this guy called Yuan, and he lived in a place called Chu, which he loved. But he was sent away by the king because some evil guys said that he was conspiring against him. So he moved to the mountains and he taught the villagers about how to be good people and why they should love their kingdom Chu. And the orchid goddess heard him and liked what she heard, so she cast a magic spell on the orchids, which he had taken from his homeland. So anyway, a week later, Chu got really sick and coughed some blood onto the orchids, but they were magic flowers, so they actually grew and more flowers came. Then Chu smelled the orchids and became really healthy, and the flowers kept growing, and soon they were like flowers all over the mountains. So then Chu decided to go and fight for his country. But when he heard that Chu had been taken over by another kingdom, he got so depressed that he just threw himself into a river, and when he died, the orchids all died too. Obviously, the villagers were sad, but the scent of the orchids continued to float around. So the orchid is really symbolic in China, and they call it the gentleman's flower. And Yuan is the orchid god because he was selfless and pure-hearted and tough like the orchid. Whew. Okay. So it wasn't the sort of thing I would say in an examination, but I think it would certainly keep my friends entertained, right? Sometimes using colloquial or informal words helps us relate and connect with other people, so the environment becomes more relaxed. Was yours similar? You can try this with any of the stories that you've learned before, if you like. It can be quite funny. But the question now is this: how can we use this information and this story in a conversation? We know by now that it isn't quite as easy as just being able to say to someone, "Hey, I've got a good story to tell you," because sometimes it's just not relevant. I'm going to pose a few questions to you that a close friend, a close foreign friend might ask. I want you to think about how you could answer these questions and somehow bring in the story of Yuan. For this lesson, you can keep the conversation informal. You can use less complex vocabulary and even some trendy words if you like. It would be nice if you brought a sense of humour to the conversation too, but don't pressure yourself too much with that. Here are the questions. Take about 10 minutes to write down some answers. Then, when you are ready, you can play the video again. Off you go. Okay, now you've prepared some answers. As we have done before, we will have a virtual conversation. So, I'm playing the part of your close foreign friend. We are going for a hike in the mountains and stop for lunch when we start this conversation. Remember, you can stop the video at any moment, but when you see the white background with the question written on it, it suggests that you might need to pause it so you can answer in detail. Are you ready? Oh, I am so hungry. What have you brought for lunch? I still can't get used to Chinese food. I brought a tuna sandwich. It's so beautiful around here, right? Do you go on hikes very often? I've noticed there are so many beautiful flowers in China. Many are really different to the ones I see in England. What do you think is the most beautiful flower or plant in China and why? Does this flower or plant have any significance to you or China? Like, is it symbolic in some way? I think I've heard about this man, Yuan, before. Can you tell me a little bit more about the story, please? I like to understand about these things more deeply. Ah, it seems that you like this story, but it's got quite a sad ending. What do you like most about it? If I were a flower or plant, I think I would be a Christmas tree because their leaves are green all year round. That's a bit like me. I've got a lot of energy all year round. And furthermore, it symbolises Christmas, which is family time for me. And you can dress them up with glitter and decorations, and I love to get dressed up. In addition to all of which, you put gifts underneath them. And who doesn't like receiving gifts, right? If you were to have a flower connected to you or symbolic of you and your personality, what would it be? I love that answer. But for now, let's eat our lunch. All of this thinking has made me even hungrier. Okay, that's it for today's lesson. I hope that you've enjoyed it.